Nyata. Uh, Welcome everybody, and welcome to my guest here this evening, Matthew Burns.
Wow, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. Hi everybody out there as well, joining us here on YouTube Live. My name is Rueben Berg. I'm a proud Gunnismara man, and it's an absolute pleasure to be able to talk to everybody here today via YouTube from my home here on both the lands of the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri peoples. And so I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the different various lands. I think I've just got a bit of echo from hearing myself talking twice there, but that's okay. I'd like to acknowledge all the various traditional owners of the lands that everyone might be joining us here today. And I pay my respects to elders both past and present, and recognise that it is really powerful to be able to do that, especially the conversation we're having here about treaty. I say it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'd much rather be in person with people, sitting around and having a chat, but unfortunately these times this is kind of some of the best ways we've got of communicating. But I thought I'd just have this chat here this afternoon, and really pleased to have joining me Matthew Burns. So hello again, Matthew. You want to say hello and introduce yourself?
Well, hi, thanks, Rueben. Thanks for having me. Matt Burns. I'm a Tunarang man. Also, I'd like to just acknowledge country and acknowledge traditional owners of the land. Myself and my family live also in Bunurong Wurundjeri area, want to acknowledge the work that they're doing to work forward with regard to their boundaries, and also pay respects to all Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people listening in today.
Fantastic. And for everyone who is joining us along here live, you can ask questions. We've got the opportunity to ask questions there in the YouTube chat box there. Also, if you've joined from Facebook, if that's easiest for you, you can ask questions there on Facebook, and I'll be checking in them throughout the conversation today. But what we thought we might do first, before we get to questions, is just have a bit of a chat here and talk about where we are so far with what the Chamber's been doing in the first People's Assembly, and also talk about exactly what happened in our last Chamber, which was, again, a very exciting thing to be a part of. And then we'll try and take some of those questions. So feel free to put some questions in there. Let us know that you can see us, you can hear us as well. That'd be great to know it's all working too, because this is my first time trying to stream on YouTube as well. But so Matt, you're here joining us. Do you want to tell us a bit more about yourself?
To say you're doing a very good job with all the different media fielding questions. Myself. So as I said, Matt Burns, Tunarang man. I'm the CEO of Tunarang Land and Waters Council. I'm a Metro elected member, just like yourself, Rueben. Mm-hmm. So I represent the Metro region, albeit being a Tunarang man. As I said, so I work, on a daily basis with Tunarang, with our community, and progressing Tunarang interests on Tunarang country. I also sit as a board member on Goulburn Valley Water, which is one of the water corporations that supplies drinking water and sanitation. Also sit on the Federation of Victorian Traditional Owner Corporations as well, which is, some people may or may not be aware, is a collective of some traditional owner groups who choose to try to work together to advocate through the state to get better outcomes for traditional owners. Myself personally, so I guess my background is I grew up on the Mornington Peninsula, so down in a place called Sorrento. Sorrento kindergarten, primary school, and all that kind of stuff. Grew up in an area where it's a pretty white part of the world, to be honest. My family descends back through, obviously, Tunarang, but through Corranderk Mission out of Hillsville, and then moved down into the Mornington Peninsula over time. Our connection at the time was, we've been largely dispossessed, like a lot of Tunarang people, actually, to be honest. My mum spent her time with her grandfather going down to Lake Tyers Mission, actually, to go and see family. And that was really the only connection that my mum had with community, because of just as I said, the effects of colonisation and our communities, and myself growing up in a very very white area. I didn't have much to do with Aboriginal community until probably 15 years ago when I got the opportunity to be more involved with Tanarung and more involved once I kind of moved out of home and things like that, and have been more involved ever since. So, yeah.
There you go. And what made you put your hand up to be a part of the First People's Assembly of Victoria?
Honestly, the thing that I thought that I had was probably a different skill set that maybe could be useful to the Assembly. I have a financial services background, so I was a commercial advisor with one of the banks, working specifically on investments, divestments for business owners. I ran a financial planning company before. I was registered as a tax advisor under the Tax Practitioners Board once upon a time.
Good to know.
So I felt as though I had maybe a skill set that could be complementary to the other knowledge holders and other skill sets that come to the Assembly. So that's why I put my hand up to say, hey, I feel like I've got something to give, and I'm really excited and motivated, being in the position that I am with Tanarung. I'm just really excited about the last couple of years, the shift towards self-determination. It's a slow journey. It will be a slow journey, but we're really actually starting to feel that things are changing. We are being heard through state agencies around decision-making on country. And I just wanted to play a role in continuing to progress that and get some genuine reform instead of just, baby steps.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point you make there, that there is this shift within society at the moment in terms of better recognising the role of traditional owners in particular in decision making, especially here in Victoria. And I think you can't just see this treaty process in isolation. There's a lot of stuff that's been happening, and I think it's a pretty powerful thing to be a part of. And like you, that's kind of why I got involved, to be a part of it and to kind of shape that the best way we could. Some people joining us might not be as familiar with the actual role of the First People's Assembly of Victoria. And as you mentioned, we're both elected representatives. So the Assembly is made up of elected representatives from different regions across the state. And there's also then representatives from each of the different traditional owner groups. The registered Aboriginal parties have an opportunity to elect and nominate a representative as well. And so we're the ones who make up the Assembly chamber. And we have then been recognised as the body that the government wants to work with in terms of progressing the treaty process. And our key job is around the treaty negotiating framework, the establishment of the treaty authority, and the establishment of the self-determination fund. And so those are our key roles under the legislation. We don't have a specific mandated role in terms of any sort of national treaty process. We don't have a role in terms of actually directly negotiating the treaty as things are set up at the moment. We're just about establishing that framework. Do you find any still misconceptions about the role of the First People's Assembly out there in your communications?
Yeah, I do. I think more and more people, the people that are engaged, are starting to understand the role of the Assembly. At first, it was a little bit confusing because I think people still felt that the role of the Assembly was to negotiate some form of treaty, whereas I feel as though more and more now communications got better between Assembly members to their communities, and also the Assembly as a First People's Assembly itself as a communications entity has been able to communicate a lot better to the broader community to establish, what our role is. I guess the miscommunication is that we're seen as, in a way, as a catch-all sometimes for everything else. And it probably goes to the point that I think the Premier at the time, in the first chamber meeting at Parliament, suggested that we will be bringing things to you. We want to have conversations outside of the treaty process, which adds to it. And obviously, this is probably the preeminent group, as the Assembly is the preeminent kind of group in Victoria at this point in time. So it makes sense to want to bring stuff to it. However, I'm really conscious and aware that it doesn't matter how successful we are in advocating and progressing other things, which I still think we should be doing, but we'll be ultimately measured against the treaty framework, self-determination front, and the treaty authority, getting them established and getting the opportunity for a statewide treaty, and then the multiple traditional owner treaties from there.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, we have those core objectives that we've been established to try and achieve, and I think that has to be our main focus. But if we can achieve some other outcomes along the way, I think that's good. But yeah, we can't lose focus of what of those three kind of core ideas. And that's, and to me, the one of the most important ones there is what that framework is and how we actually set it up so that those who come next, who actually sit at the table and negotiate treaties, are in the best position to be able to do that. Yeah. So we just had our most recent chamber meeting, which we had to do online, which was quite challenging. Obviously, we were able to do the first two chamber meetings in person, but we had to do our most recent two online, which came with its own challenges and difficulties. But I think it was a good meeting. How did you walk away from that meeting?
Look, I walked away pretty positive. I mean, sometimes a couple of days straight can be a little bit grueling, I think, but it's really important work. And I mean, all of it is something that's kind of captivating. So you do get tired because it's all really relevant content. All the assembly members have something unique to bring to the table, and I think that's why it's really important to have a chamber. If there was a smaller group,
diversity is fantastic that we've got on there. It's a really good diverse group.
Because if it's a smaller group, we could all come to consensus pretty easily on some things, but you're not getting the broader cross section of views from community, which is really important. So I think it's been really valuable. The meeting itself went well. There was a number of resolutions for decision that came through, which I think all were kind of decided on and endorsed with some minor adjustments to a couple. But I feel like in a way, this meeting to me almost felt like we've gone through a lot of the administrative setup, structure work, how are we going? And then this meeting, it almost felt like this was when we're going to kick into gear from now into the next chamber meetings, really making some progress. And with the intermittent dispute resolution, the treaty framework discussion, truth telling, all those things, it really feels like there's things that are really kicking off.
Yeah, and I guess it's probably important too to point out to people that we have these assembly chamber meetings, and I guess at least the way I've been approaching them is that they're about kind of formalizing and endorsing the work that's been going on in between the chamber meetings. So we don't just do nothing in between the chambers. There's it's mostly done by committees. So all those key topics that we've got to cover, they've been different committees established, and all members of the assembly are welcome to be a part of those committees. I'm just part of the treaty negotiating framework committee, but you're involved in a couple of committees, is that right? Or?
Yeah, so just checking I wasn't on mute. So I'm in the Treaty Framework Committee and the Self-Determination Fund Committee. So there's those meetings that occur, and also off the back of that, in between Assembly chamber meetings, is the communication to community, which has been difficult now, but it's about, the subcommittees coming up with thoughts and ideas of what they think and their community are telling them is important, and then the Assembly trying to communicate that appropriately to get feedback and being able to test those kind of ideas. And I guess that the draft plans that the Assembly might have, get that confirmation, then go to the Assembly pretty confident knowing that what the community is asking for is what is in this resolution, most of the time. Anyway, yes.
Yeah, and as you said, importantly, anything that the committees do comes to the full Assembly chamber for approval. So everything that's treaty related along those key themes, those decisions are made by the full Assembly. But a lot of the work in preparing what that proposal will be comes in those committees. And so they're really important parts of it as well. Yeah. So I thought I'd just step through a few of the things we did talk about specifically, but people can find, there was a communique that got published, I think earlier this week on the First People's Assembly website. People can jump on there and find I think it's a 2-pager summary of what we got up to. One of the things that we do have the opportunity to do as Assembly members is we can raise business that we want to have discussed that wasn't necessarily directed by the committees. And I took advantage of that, and I raised an issue for us to discuss, which was around the 26th of January. And I think it was a really interesting conversation. I didn't come with a specific agenda. I just wanted to make sure that we didn't wait until November, which is when our next chamber meeting is, to actually have that discussion, because it is an important discussion to have. And so we had a good discussion, and I think there was general consensus that people didn't think it was the right day to celebrate. But I think there's still a bit of work to be done about what role we play in moving forward on that. And so I believe that the agreement from that discussion was the board's going to put together a proposal to bring back to members in November for us to consider that. What were your thoughts around that?
Yeah, look, it's interesting, as you say, everyone's, clearly the large majority of the Assembly were very clear that 26th is not the right day. However, there are multiple ideas still out there of different days that might work, different symbolic days for Aboriginal people, or, past Aboriginal leaders and elders, and all that kind of stuff. So there still needs to be some work done and consensus around that. As you say, though, I mean, having it now provides the opportunity for the state, as they said, that they will lean on us for advice with certain things. Well, this is an opportunity not to be lent on for advice, but to give forward-thinking advice as well to the state. How does that apply to a national level? I don't know, but clearly there's an important role for us to take. As I said, we're probably the preeminent structure in Victoria, if not potentially Australia at this point in time, with advancing treaties. So the voice can be powerful, and the work that we do can be really powerful. So look, it's one of the things that is perfect to bring forward for a chamber meeting to have progressed that conversation. I know Arnie Donner and a few others in the past, we've been talking about stolen generation, and that conversation's been progressing really, really well. I mean, it always seems to be too slow, but at the same time, it is progressing along. And this conversation, I'd suggest, would not kind of fall away. I think the Assembly will do its job and do it well with preparing a paper, and then no doubt there'll be some actions off the back of that as well.
Yeah, and I guess a great call to community as well out there, that if you do have strong views about it and about what should happen and what role the Assembly should play as well, get in touch with your Assembly representatives, let them know your thoughts, and hopefully we can all take that on board and progress that conversation.
From memory, I think that was actually what I suggested. I think at the back of this was like, we all had these ideas. How about we just go to community and maybe structure up some questions to get some clear responses back on how we should progress this.
Sure. And so people can provide that feedback straight away down below as well in the YouTube chat, as any other questions you might have too. So welcome those. We've got a few questions coming through, and we'll get to those near the end. And also, if you're easier on Facebook, as I said, very happy to go. I'll hop over on Facebook and have a look at any questions we get asked over there. One of the other, I think, really important things that came out of the Assembly chamber was that we authorised the negotiators for the first People's Assembly to finalise an interim dispute resolution process. And so that's the mechanism to ensure that we can really start having those negotiations with government. Once we actually have that process, that enables us to really sit down and have those conversations. So I think that was a really important outcome. And Nagara Murray in particular, and the whole committee that she's a part of, have done some really great work in that area. We also met with the Minister, which was great. So the Minister came along to have a chat to us as the first time that she'd come to speak to us as a chamber, having taken up that role more recently, the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. So that was really fantastic to have her there. And there were some good questions we got to talk to her about. And I think she shared some really good insights. And I think she, from my perspective, demonstrated a really strong commitment to the work that this is going to take to progress these matters. What were your reflections on it?
Yeah, look, I felt the same way. I think she was honest. From what I could tell, she seemed genuinely honest. She, as you say, genuinely committed to trying to progress things, but also didn't strike me as the type of person that had paid lip service to a group of people just for the sake of it. She seemed very measured in her words to want to commit to something that she could commit to. And I felt as though there was a passion there for her to try and drive stuff internally within the Labor Party, within Parliament, to get right outcomes. So that was really pleasing. As you said, there were some great questions. The Assembly put in a little bit of work previously to make sure that we did have the questions on point, to ensure that, we weren't wasting our opportunities, which was good. I guess that's my reflection. I felt as though that she struck me as someone who was genuine, which sometimes isn't always the case, which I thought was really, really a positive.
Yeah, and it would be great when we can actually get a chance to have a conversation in person, but for having a Zoom conversation, I think it went pretty well. You actually asked a really good question, which I was hoping you could share a bit about here, and it was your reflection in terms of the shifting role that government, and in particular a department like Aboriginal Victoria, might play moving forward, and how the landscapes may be changing in terms of how that's working?
Yeah, so step back a touch. I guess the state government are committed to, I guess, a self-determination plan or a self-determination commitment with what they call Aboriginal Victorians, so traditional owners and Aboriginal community, that there needs to be a bit more self-determination with Aboriginal communities, nations or communities in general. And that's because, communities know what's best for them and nations know what's best for them. And when we're talking about nations, we're talking about sovereign country to be managed. And in the past, Aboriginal Victoria, I guess you could say, were the bastion or the leader of Aboriginal affairs up until not too long ago, that they were progressing and driving Aboriginal affairs matters and ensuring outcomes. But in the last few years, it's the self-determination opportunities, which, as I said, are not fully there, and treaty hopefully will be able to bring that in its fullest form, was that given the state's commitment, entities like Aboriginal Victoria now almost have to redefine themselves because of the role that they had played previously and the role now that traditional owners are playing on country, self-determining ACOs and other communities having more self-determination and authority over the way they do their own community business. So I guess the question is, yes, there's the commitment to us, but also insularly, as an agency, as a department, as a state entity, how are they looking internally to redefine themselves, which also empowers self-determination? So that was in a very long-winded version of the question, but that is effectively it.
Yeah, no, I thought it was a really interesting question. And I think some of the other conversations that I've heard previously around the whole treaty process from a government perspective was that, importantly, it shouldn't be seen that these types of conversations should just wait for treaty to kind of solve them all. Like, that's not what I think any of us want, that everything just stalls until we actually have treaties. I think government needs to be thinking about these things right now and trying to work out how it can progress towards a goal. That goal might shift as we get closer and closer to treaties and know what that actually looks like, but they can still be starting to make steps towards that and not just stick with the status quo until we actually know the outcomes.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a danger, I think, for agencies all across the board have the ability to essentially say, oh, that can wait till treaty, and try to lump everything in the treaty basket instead of progressing things as they should be right now. And as you say, I mean, Aboriginal Victoria, I feel they've got a role to play. They will continue to have a very important role to play, but I think that role is maybe changing, and that's not limited to AV. I think it's limited. It's across the board around how do our self-determining structures then connect to agencies like Aboriginal Victoria, and what are the roles that we're playing moving forward. So that's just an interesting thought.
And I think interestingly, I think for both you and I, we both actually have formalised roles within government on water boards and water corporations. Myself also on the Heritage Council, and so I do find it interesting that having that kind of dual view of these things, of having the view from the Assembly perspective of what we're trying to achieve there, and having a view from within government as well. And kind of that's sometimes a bit of a conflict within that, but I think that there is this drive to push towards self-determination, not just coming from Aboriginal people, but coming from government. I think lessens some of that tension that might be there. How do you find that?
Can you ask that question again, if that's okay?
How do you find being actually yourself, essentially a government, a person on a government agency, as a director? You actually are part of the government as well as being part of the Assembly, trying to negotiate an outcome with government.
Yeah, so look, I'm a representative of the Water Minister, effectively, as a board member of Goulburn Valley Water. So it's easy enough to say that I wear different hats and I put different hats on in different circumstances, and I do. And you just do that. Personally, I just do that naturally. I walk into a situation when we're talking about water corporation board stuff. Obviously, I have those inherent kind of rights and values that are enshrined in me as a traditional owner that I'm always cognizant and conscious of. But it's something that, yeah, I don't know. It's a tough one, I guess. But yeah, I think it's just, I do genuinely just make a shift. I bring those things with me as an Aboriginal person into the Water Corporation and make sure I don't, sway away from those values. But at the same time, you are in a different mindset, and government structure and Water Corporation structures are. It's a very strong governance, compliance kind of space, which no doubt the environmental water holder space is for you as well. So,
No, I just think it's interesting that there are a few of us who are on the Assembly who are in various ways, some just directly employed by government, some with government roles, and it's an interesting kind of position to be in. One of the other things that we progressed was around the elders' voice, and that's a really, really important part of the process for the Assembly, an important mechanism to have within the Assembly, that elders' voice. And so out of that, we endorsed a sample model that would then be shared with community for community comment. And so that should be a public-facing version of that should be coming out fairly soon to try and get as much feedback as we can. And it is quite challenging in this time. And I think there are potentially more challenges trying to engage with elders through this process than it might be for other members of the community, given that it's all online. But I think that was a really powerful step towards that in terms of that elders' voice. We also had a further conversation around the pathways for recognition. And so that was something that was raised in our previous chamber meeting, where we agreed to pursue ideas of how we could have all nations represented on the Assembly, because at the moment it's not all groups have one of those reserved seats. They are just for the groups who have registered Aboriginal party status, and obviously not all groups have that status. And so there was, I think it's an important conversation to have. I'm not sure about your view. I'll hear that in a moment. I thought I'd share my view first, I guess, that I'm still wary of the way some of these conversations are framed, in terms of there seems to be sometimes this sense that because there's only 10 RAPs represented, that only a very small part of the community is represented through those RAPs. But if you look at a map, it's like 75% of the state, the land mass of the state, has a registered Aboriginal party. And some of the places where there isn't yet a RAP is where it's a clear dispute between two existing RAPs. So that land is represented by the groups, but not who they are. And so whilst I think it's really important we have that full recognition, I think we're a long way further than I think sometimes the perception in the community might be about how much we've got representation at the moment. What are your kind of views on that?
Yeah, so look, I support that as well. Yeah, you're right. There are a lot of areas where are contested. So, I won't go into them, but there's lots of contested areas where there's two RAPs in different areas, and then the middle area needs to be sorted out between the two.
Or three RAPs.
Yeah, or three, or three, or four. Yeah, you're right that there are some Bermuda triangles around around Victoria where multiple.
I've been locked in those for occasions. Yep.
Yeah. Well, Tanarung, Wurundjeri, and Jar Jarrung have hanging rock, for instance. So, yeah. Look, so I mean, I support that as well. We want to get full recognition. I guess the view is that it can be perceived, as you said, that it's not, there isn't as much recognition or not representation as there is, but there are a lot of representatives who aren't representing a traditional owner group, who are traditional owners of different areas. That's not to say that they're representing their community as an elected member as opposed to an appointed person, so it's different. But at the same time, again, perfect world, you'd have all the mobs there doing it. At the moment, we're trying to negotiate a framework. There is community consultation. Hopefully there's enough catch-all in all of the community consult, the representatives being elected or representative of a traditional owner group, to be able to bring framework discussions that are ample for nations into the future and future recognised groups to be able to negotiate their treaties where there's no shortfall for them not being part of the process as it is now because of things that are out of our control, because there are existing structures for recognition, whether we agree with them or not.
Yeah. And I think also another key point around that additional recognition that might take place is that that's quite different from the recognition of which groups are going to be able to sit at the table and negotiate a treaty outcome. So people might recall that we previously had a decision made by the Assembly that the format of treaties would be the hybrid model, so that there could be both a statewide treaty, but also localized treaties with different groups. And who those groups are that can have those local treaties, that's something that we as an Assembly will have to negotiate with government. And so that the government will have to be a party to those discussions, and there's going to have to be agreement with them about what those groups are.
Yeah.
The groups that we can have as additional members to our Assembly, that doesn't have to be agreed by government. We're not controlled at all by government in that regard. So we can determine that ourselves, but that doesn't mean that they'll automatically have those other rights. And I think that's a really delicate and sensitive and important part of the conversation to have as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, to go to the point where, I know you've been conscious, I have been, you've been vocally conscious in a positive way, is that, yes, we can say as an Assembly, as a community, this is the way it's going to be, but there is another side, which is the state, who have to agree to that framework as well. And when it comes to who is able to negotiate treaty, the state are going to come pretty strong about some views around, if a group's already got native title, already has an ILUA over an area, then another group is not going to be able to negotiate a treaty over an existing. It's just a reality, because one group already holds all the rights. One nation or collective owns those rights already. So it's going to be difficult. And we might say that this is the high watermark, and the state will say, no, the high watermark is somewhere else. And that's going to be, that's where, a lot of the negotiations on the framework are going to be. It's not about what's in, what's out. Hopefully everything's in. It's just about all the qualifiers to actually get to the point of negotiating. And then the game of tennis that people are going to pay, the rules around how that is to get, sovereignty genuinely recognised, and there is a level of authority and autonomy in what is a post-colonised kind of state. So it's going to be a really interesting and very difficult piece of work. The framework is going to be very difficult.
Yeah, and that was the next thing we did discuss as part of the chamber, was just endorsing the next steps for the Assembly in terms of that treaty framework. And so I think that's a really key thing for us to touch on. And importantly, to kind of just frame the framework for people who might not be familiar with it, is the framework is kind of the guidance, a way that the Assembly and government can sit and agree on how the process for negotiating actual treaties will go. Because, as I've said a few times before, actually, this hasn't happened before. We haven't done this before, of negotiating a treaty. This should have been done 200 years ago, but it hasn't happened. And so we need to sit down and work out how we're going to do this. And what I don't want is that a group who does come to negotiate a treaty gets ambushed with all this stuff they weren't expecting. And so that's the point of the framework, is to put as much stuff out on the table and be clearly understood between the parties before they do that. So you're not walking in and being ambushed as part of that. And so that's what the framework is about. And one of the things I know we've been discussing a lot is what is on the table and what's off the table in terms of rights. And there's been conversations around the bundle of rights. And I've always been quite strong of saying, everything should be on the table. And that's where I'm going to continue to push my views around ensuring that, as a starting point, everything should be on the table. But as you mentioned, it's going to be a negotiation to see where government thinks things should be as a starting point and what's off the table, because they might have ideas of what's off the table. We don't know yet. So I think that's really interesting. What are your thoughts around where we're getting to so far in terms of the actual on the table, off the table, those parts of the conversation?
I wholly agree. As sovereign nations, excuse my son, just when the sound's getting something from the room.
Good.
Everything's on the table, because sovereignty's never been ceded. All the rights and modern rights that exist, as traditional owners, we're not setting time 200 or so years ago in terms of our culture. We've evolved as a modern culture as well, and those rights that apply to everyday citizens also apply to us, because they're rights that apply to traditional owner lands. So, everything has to be on the table, because everything's a bargaining chip. Why would you concede things when they are bargaining chips to negotiate on? Giving away things that the state may think are obvious. Well, that's not necessarily the case. Everything has to be on the table. I think people need to understand that what a statewide treaty and a national treaty might be covering, because a statewide treaty covers lots of things that are relevant to traditional owners on country. So I've written them down anyway, but law and order, schools, which is language education, hospitals and associated healthcare, water, transport, agriculture, forests, and local government. So they're the things that the state have responsibility for. They don't have responsibility for lighthouses, which is a federal thing. They don't have responsibility for, immigration and stuff and stuff like that. But those are the things where forests, local government, agriculture, water, schools, law and order, and education, a lot of the things that we've been talking to, substantively in the Assembly and for the last 200 years anyway. So, they're the things that are in, and all of those things and all the different subsets of those areas are all on the table. Absolutely, they need to be.
Yeah. And I think what's going to be really tricky with the framework is trying to find that balance of getting a sense of what is kind of on the table in a kind of broad sense, but not being too prescriptive, so that a group comes in and says, well, we want to negotiate this, and they say, well, that wasn't on the table, so it's not included.
Yeah,
that's definitely not what we want as an outcome from this. So.
Well, without being dismissive of the Traditional Owner Settlement Act, it's great. There's great empowerment and it's great progression. But at the same time, there isn't, I guess some people accuse it to be a very cookie cutter-ish, about this is the model, this is how you fit into the model, and there's no room for creativity. Now, asserting sovereign rights may involve very different views about country for different traditional owners in the localised treaties, and there needs to be room for creativity and a different approach. And it's not just a cookie cutter that, one group gets this, the other group gets exactly the same. That's not how sovereignty needs to be recognised.
Yeah, for sure. And that's where I think that hopefully the framework can establish some of that process around how that can happen. And as I said before, the aim is to have a statewide treaty and those local treaties, and that's still something to negotiate with government to get agreement on that. But I would imagine that would be something they would be open to, in terms of from my understanding of it all. But one thing I've been mulling over in my mind is whether or not the statewide treaty would just be kind of a one thing that you try and have fully realized, or whether you could just do it kind of on those different themes you spoke about, so that you could start to just have a negotiation around one element of that, whether it's education, whether it's water, and then actually have an agreement on that element. And then you can start doing stuff around it as we continue to negotiate the other elements. Well, not we, as those other elements get negotiated.
Yeah.
Because it's going to take a long time to negotiate all those different outcomes. So
yeah, you're right.
That's one thing I've been thinking about. That might help us to help the negotiating, whoever's doing that process, get some of those outcomes.
And now that I think of it, it'd take 10 years probably to negotiate a statewide treaty once the framework was established to get through all those things. And you're probably right that it needs to be an evolving piece where you take chunks of, maybe it's education, the truth-telling process and truth and justice process might really inform what the first step is for a statewide treaty. I think it probably will. So you're probably right, because, education, a right enshrined under the UN Declaration for rights of Indigenous people is that we can control our own education system. Is that something that we want to do as a state? Now, that would probably be a statewide function. Is it something where there are Koori schools, Koori universities, or is there just Koori curriculum? Koori, Kulin, some people get stuck up on Koori. It's a New South Wales term, but so there's definitely, as I said, otherwise it may take way too long to bring anything to fruition, which may be another generation down the track, which will be frustrating, disappointing as well. Yeah,
I guess one of the biggest challenges then might be working out which things you're going to try and tackle first, because everyone's going to want to think that their particular issue of importance is going to be the one you want to tackle first. But
as you say, education, some groups and some mobs will think that is, others will say water is the first thing that needs to be sorted. So it's, as you say.
And as I've tried to keep clear, and I do confuse myself sometimes too, is that the actual process of negotiating a treaty, who is doing that process is not yet determined. Of who's actually sitting across the table and negotiating the actual treaty is not yet determined. And I think that's a really important thing that people are clear on, because that was one of the things that was quite clearly articulated when the Assembly was established. What was the Assembly's role was to establish the framework for treaties, not to negotiate actual treaties. But I think we will have to specify and suggest how those statewide treaties are going to be negotiated. Have you got any thoughts at the moment around that?
So it might sound controversial until I clarify, is that I think it probably will be the Assembly, but it'll be the future elected version of the Assembly. Post-framework establishment, that they're probably, I'm guessing there might be a re-election of people, and then hopefully the recognition across the state has occurred where traditional owner groups, whether they're there just for negotiation or whether they're there potentially to be able to negotiate themselves individually as a nation, I'd like to think that the additional pathway to recognition has been sorted, and then maybe that would be the group of people that would be re-elected onto the Assembly, I'm guessing, maybe, or a different version of that, to then start negotiating a statewide treaty. That's, I guess, my immediate pragmatic thoughts. I don't know if that's what would happen, but to me that makes sense, because there already is a structure. We've been elected to do a job. Yep. Then the future Assembly can then redefine maybe, and then if that's, you know, something the community think is appropriate, then that's maybe the way to go.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that's the most reasonable and logical way of looking at it, but that's not always the way that it's always going to go, or the way that everyone else is going to look at it necessarily. And we come from it too, from a vested interest already being a part of the Assembly, and so understandably people from outside that will likely have very different perspectives. But it would seem
we might not get re-elected.
Yeah. It would seem strange to have the Assembly set up and start this process and then have to try and establish a totally new entity to take the next step. But I'm always quite strong in that we, as the current elected group, it's not our job to negotiate those actual treaties. It may well be the job of the next group who are elected, which could include us if we get re-elected, as you said. So I think that's where I'm seeing it as well. But I think a key part of that process too is then coming to understand, well, at what point do the local treaties get negotiated? Do they need to wait till certain outcomes of the statewide treaty are negotiated? Do they go in parallel? How does that all work? That's a whole nother part of the process we need to be thinking through. That's really quite complicated, and there's lots of pros and cons either way.
Yeah, that's really tricky. I immediately I thought, oh well, they probably could get negotiated, but some of the statewide treaty discussion may potentially could create a formal authority that has legislated authority as an Aboriginal kind of chamber, parliamentary chamber that has full autonomy over land as a state. I don't know. It's something that may have impact on a local treaty. So it's a really difficult question to ask, and we haven't had that discussion in the framework yet. You know, as you said, we're keeping everything on the table, but what's the interplay, and what are the potential interplay between a statewide treaty and how it speaks to a local, localized treaty? That's a tough question, and I don't know the answer.
Well, I mean, I think flexibility is going to be the key. That the actual treaties that get negotiated, the framework has to enable those to be flexible. It can't just be that whatever you're locking in stone at that point in time, that's it. That's what you're stuck with as a group or as a state. They have to be things that can adapt and change. And I would like to think that, you know, if a certain group is able to negotiate a treaty outcome, and then another group comes along and they negotiate some better outcomes, that previous group should be able to, you know, build on that and say, well, actually, that group's done that, so we want to build on ours as well. They shouldn't just be static things. And I think that's what we've heard from overseas as well.
Yeah, well, it's important that some of the first groups that take that step into the future aren't disadvantaged, because they should be applauded for taking that risk to be one of the first ones to go and do it, which is a very bold thing to do and brave thing to do. And that's the same with the Traditional Owner Settlement Act. Each group after seems to be building on that, but the state at this point in time have a commitment to try and equalise. But look, maybe similar to the statewide conversation about maybe biting off bits and pieces, maybe the localised treaties as well might be logically able to take some of the less contentious or less areas that maybe have less potential interplay with a statewide treaty to negotiate certain things as they evolve. And as you say, flexibility is really important. You know, what was the Australian landscape, you know, cultural law and law on country then to 250 years later? We'd like to think that, you know, if a treaty doesn't get stuck in time again with what may happen in the next 200 years on country.
Yeah. And I guess importantly for people who are listening in as part of this conversation, these are the kind of challenging questions we're trying to grapple with as the Assembly. And if anyone out there has strong views or any sort of views about these things, we'd love to hear those. Get in touch with your Assembly representatives and share your thoughts on some of those complex things about what that framework can actually look like. Because anyone who's listening to this, they could be part of those negotiations moving forward, to actually have to sit at the table to negotiate a treaty, and have a think about what you want to make sure that process looks like, so you can be in the best position to get the best outcomes for your community and for your people moving forward. And I think that's a really, really important thing to keep in mind. And we want to hear those perspectives. We want to hear people's views on those things as well. But it is understandably quite a complex thing, and we're still grappling with all that complexity as well, and that makes it challenging for everybody, really. So yeah. You mentioned previously the truth-telling process as well, and that's another thing that we did finalise in terms of a next steps moving forward from the Assembly perspective, that there's going to be now established a dedicated committee. We mentioned those various committees. Now there'll be an additional committee around that truth-telling process. So I think that was another good outcome that came from that Assembly chamber. And as I said, if you want a full summary of that Assembly chamber business, that's all available on the website for the First People's Assembly of Victoria. And I'll make sure I share a link with that on my Facebook page as well. Any other particular comments you wanted to share as we progress so far?
Oh, look, the only other thing was you talked about the committees, the subcommittees that are working on different streams. So the Treaty Framework, Self-Determination Fund, Treaty Authority, Cultural Governance Committee, Elders' Voice, and now potentially the Truth-Telling. There is you mentioned it, but there is a mountain of work that is done within those committees. And I guess the only other thing is that the chairs do a mountain of work as well. It's very intensive, but I mean, that's the thing that we signed up for. You know, we are remunerated as a stipend, but definitely the amount of effort and time put in doesn't, you know, you don't get remunerated for that. You're actually doing it for the love, really. And especially the committee and the chairs, they seriously put in a lot of hours, not including board meetings as well that a lot of them attend, to really drive forward this treaty. So I just wanted to say that, you know, acknowledge their work. It's been, you know, it's good to sit in the committee meetings and provide feedback and read the papers and, you know, but at the same time, a lot of that work is driven by the committee chairs. So yeah, it's good, and just want to acknowledge that.
Yeah, and the great staff we have too at the First People's Assembly,
absolutely,
who support that work. Yeah. So we've got a few questions here in the chat, so I'll try and throw those at you, and you can hit them back to me if you want me to try and answer them as well. And then we'll wrap up in 10 or so minutes. So there's a question we've got here around how is COVID restrictions affecting treaty negotiations?
So effectively, the treaty negotiations just officially started at the last chamber meeting officially. So I can't necessarily comment on how it's affected. I can tell you how it's affected our process, which is it's very hard, as we were talking about Elders' Voice and passing that sample. It's very hard to communicate with community. It's not an easy platform. In some instances, it's easy to have conversations, but when you're wanting to have conversations with community, you have the formal piece of work, typically in a hall at somewhere, and then you just have conversations off the side at lunch, you know, at morning tea, and you just get to know what community's views are individually, and those things are really lacking. So it is hard because of not those kind of more intimate conversations that you'd have with elders, knowledge holders, or just community in general. So for me, that's what I found. It's a little bit difficult. You kind of you're almost narrowcasting a little bit in the video streaming space and the way that we're having to operate.
Yeah. I asked this question, the survey that I put out previously around what were people's views about, you know, what we should be progressing as an assembly. And there are a few responses saying, you know, we should just stop and not do anything. But the majority of responders were saying that in some way, shape or form, we should be continuing. Some were suggesting just keep doing the work, like it has to be done. We've got to just keep doing it. Some were saying if you are going to keep doing progressing work, you need to find some different ways to go about that. And I think that's a valid thing. And I know myself, I'm trying to find as many different ways as I can to get out there and communicate. But hopefully, with easing of restrictions in the some future, we can get out there and have much more engaged conversations.
Yeah.
But hopefully people have been able to hear as well. And this is a point of being able to just reflect on what the role of the assembly is and some of the complexities of it. This COVID situation, I think, has also given us a chance to be more reflective about some of those things as well. So whilst there's been quite a lot of negatives, I think there's been some positives ways of looking at things from this.
Yeah, well, I made a suggestion just so you're aware that there's an opportunity here. We have the mailing list of all the people that signed up to vote. Could be costly, but at the same time, if we want to get feedback, maybe there's questions with a return envelope, yes, no, and commentary, and just posting it back to the assembly so we can get some physical feedback if people aren't familiar with computer platforms and other things, that maybe just snail mail questions, comments areas, and just return to sender to the assembly could be a way of being able to communicate as well.
Yeah, and look, and another, I think, a valid point that's been raised previously as well was that if you do have access to technology, you know other members of your family, other members of your community that don't, if you can take that upon yourself to show some initiative and help share that and spread that message around, even though with people who don't directly have access to that, that can be a powerful thing too. And I think I'd like to think that we can see this as an entire community of what we can all do to progress these conversations and be a part of it too. So that's not to say the burden isn't still on us to lead those things, but I think I'd like to hope that some people out, and I know some people have gone to a lot of effort to ensure that people in their community who aren't attached and online as much have been a part of that process too, which is great. We've got another comment here around, I think it was reflecting on some of your earlier comments, Matthew, around the disconnection and how that's tough, and that hopefully that this is something that the treaty can help address, helping disconnected mob in the future.
Yeah. Oh, look. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure this is something that's not unique to Tanarang, but Tanarang has a lot of people that are pretty solid in who they are, always known who they were, had family kind of stories, culture, law, and things passed down to them. And then there are other people that are literally finding out yesterday that they're Aboriginal, that they're Tanarang, and they're desperate to find connection. And yeah, there definitely needs to be something for that, because myself, knowing I was Aboriginal but never having much connection because I grew up in an area that didn't have anything, it is challenging to kind of come into community as well. But yeah, there definitely needs to be something. Truth telling for us at Tanarang, we're looking at creating a process to which we can provide the opportunity for people that may not be as familiar as what our leaders and elders and probably me to some extent now, because I've been so heavily involved, are aware of who we are. It's a challenge. It's a real challenge, because disconnectedness not only includes people that know who their mob is, but others who have no idea who their mob is. And, I also feel that treaty, some disagree that treaty is all about traditional owners. I really feel that the statewide treaty needs to have consideration for Aboriginal people who live in Victoria as well, and those people that have been dispossessed completely that don't know who they are, and there needs to be a process to help them with their, as you say, disconnectedness.
I've got a question here, which I should point out. They've put their name behind it, so I'll point out who this is from. It's from Uncle Larry Walsh. And he's saying, his question is, will they be calling in local Aboriginal people who've been involved in some of the issues that are to be discussed?
Well, Uncle Larry, I would suggest, without putting me on the spot, would probably be part of the elders' voice, I would have thought. And that's where a lot of the communication and feedback through to the assembly will occur. So I think, yes, the elders' voice is going to be one of those mechanisms where, in that instance, there's senior leaders and elders of Aboriginal Victorians, and we won't want to use that term, but Aboriginal people who live in Victoria, who are traditional owners, who'll be providing a voice to moderate what the assembly are doing, what decisions are being made, and I guess even how the communication to community is to be derived. So yes, The answer is yes, through that mechanism, definitely. And no doubt there needs to be, constant improvement in communication to community in general. And I think over the 3 years and then the future iteration, communication's only going to get better. Yes, is the answer.
I think also we've moving forward in the idea of having a kind of an expert pool of people that we can draw from, and expertise, I guess, in the most broader sense. And that would be, people who might have degrees or studied in certain areas, but also just people in the community who've got a lot of work they've done in this space, to be able to draw from those, and recognizing that we on the Assembly, we definitely don't have all the answers, and we know we don't have all the answers. And so it's being able to draw from that broader expertise in the communities, I think really, really powerful to be able to do.
Yeah.
A question here from Gary Murray, who says, how do you stop TOSA undermining treaty in the northeast of Victoria?
Well, that's a question that currently, it's very hard to answer, obviously. TOSA is a recognised process. It's an alternative to native title. It includes native title elements, which is the registration of an ILUA. How do you stop it? It'd be very hard, I guess, only because the Advancing Treaty Bill, which is the legislation that kind of created the Assembly and the mechanism of the Commission, and then the Assembly says that the bill itself says that this process will not diminish the existing rights of any native title group or traditional owner group or RAP through this process. So that's what the bill says. There is the ability, I guess, for the Assembly to vote to make a change to that if that was something that the Assembly would want to do, but that would require a supermajority, I think. And how to stop that? Gary knows that there are some processes in the courts at the moment, and the courts will be determining those things, so I can't necessarily comment individually on those.
Yeah. But as you said also, who is going to sit and negotiate treaties is something that has to be agreed with the government. Like, you can't just force the government to agree to something with a group they don't want to agree with. And so the framework is about setting up and negotiating an agreement between what the Assembly views is the right outcome and what the government views. And as you pointed out earlier, the government already has groups they've recognised. And so it would be, I guess, challenging from their perspective to think that they're going to now ignore those groups they've previously recognised in lieu of other groups. And so I think
look, in my mind, it'd be very hard to, but theoretically, maybe some parts of treaty could have very different elements to it than the Traditional Owner Settlement Act and the ILUA process. But I find that very hard, and I find the state very hard. It's something that the Assembly is grappling with through the alternate pathways for recognition. If whatever comes of that requires a change to the legislation, then that may come. Who knows?
Just looking through some more of the questions here. Can organisations initiate some education platforms for interested community? So I guess that's looking more broadly about how can this broader process of what we're doing around treaty, is there a way that other institutions out there can kind of help promote and help raise awareness about some of the things we're doing?
I think the easiest question is to maybe speak to the Assembly. There is a team of staff that are there with a pretty robust communications team that can probably kind of create pathways to be able to broadcast to their networks. I think it's important. It's something that is, in my mind, is really important, because if we go from this process, which, whether we like it or not, sometimes we live in a bubble. What we see is important and should be, on the front page in the newspaper, to the broader community sometimes isn't that important. So there needs to be something in between, because if we go from where we are now to all of a sudden negotiating a treaty without broader community understanding, there's got to be uproar. So there needs to be something in a process while all this process is happening to bring the broader community along for the ride. And people might not like that, but maybe that includes the state to do, they do TAC ads and all those things in the past. Maybe there's an opportunity through truth telling where there is prime time for educating people on the history of this state, and which may help people come to an understanding of why treaty is required. I don't know,
Yeah.
but yeah, I'd speak to the Assembly.
I think we've already seen, though, some strong support from other Aboriginal organisations out there. I know there are different peak organisations, different regionally representative groups that are out there promoting the work of the Assembly and are organising events to bring and have those conversations, and are promoting the work and the conversations. And there's also an opportunity for, in terms of individuals and organisations putting submissions in of saying this is what we think should be happening. But I know that there's a lot of great of our community organisations out there who are doing some really good work promoting that. And so whilst we as the Assembly, definitely the First Peoples Assembly has that lead in that, I think there are lots of other good things happening that it's that, and we need that holistic across the broad approach in terms of having these conversations. Yeah. Another question here, which is around how's the white fella going in regards to treaty? So assuming that's looking at how's the non-Aboriginal community going in terms of their perspectives around the treaty process.
So again, this is where I really think that there needs to be a lot of work on this, just to bring people on, because Tanarang has the settlement now, and some of the newspapers were very adversarial against the Traditional Under Settlement Act. There are a few groups that have made some really derogatory comments about it. So how is it? Again, it really depends on the subset of people you're talking to. There are plenty of people who are non-Aboriginal white community that are fully on board. And you're preaching to converted with those people, so you don't need to. But there is a broader set of people that are just genuinely adversarial and disagree, and then there's probably the core of people that just have no idea at all, because they just live their lives without even thinking about it. And we need to be able to speak to those people a lot better. So how are we doing it? I don't know. As I said, I feel like the government have a role in a sense early on.
I think in that regard, I think the government has a key role. And I think they have a desire to want to see that happen as well, because it's something they've been committed to, and they want to make sure they've got community support in continuing to pursue that, which I think is important.
Well, the commission, before the Assembly was started, there were some ads about what is treaty, with prominent and other Aboriginal people within those ads talking about the idea of treaty. How do we extend that to start talking about truth and justice in a way, and start to, broadcast, help people along for the journey. A lot of the youth, kids in primary school and kindergarten, are getting an alternate education now where they're learning more about country. It's about the people that are already out of the school system that there needs to be a lot of work done.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, I think we've covered most of the questions there, and there's always an opportunity if you've got other questions for people, just put it through in emails and put it on Facebook, and I'm always happy to try and answer those questions. But I think we've covered most of the ones we've got asked there in the live chat, and so we'll start kind of wrapping up. And I just thought, Matthew, have you any last comments you wanted to make around what we've discussed so far?
No, look, thanks for having me on. This has been good. It's good to have obviously it's live, but it's good to just have a chat about this kind of stuff anyway, especially in isolation, you live in a bit of a bubble. So it's good to just have a conversation. Even these conversations as well kind of help me personally kind of, reposition my thoughts around the Assembly itself. So thank you. Thanks for everyone. Thanks for the questions. And I hope to be on again some other time to answer some questions.
We can definitely make that happen. Just repeat that. Thanks very much, Matthew Burns, for joining me here in the conversation today. Thanks for all those who's watched us live, and there'll be a chance, and people might be watching this after the fact. And if you do have questions, please don't hesitate, get in touch. Always happy to try and answer questions and take on feedback and thoughts and ideas. Really want to hear that community ideas on any of those things we've discussed here today. So thank you, everybody, and we might sign off. Well, look, bye.